item here on GitHub discussions.
Yes, so this was something, yeah, okay, so it was Chris Short and I who were talking about this. Basically, we're finding that it might be useful to turn on GitHub's discussion features, either at the organization level or possibly even at the repo level, to make it easier to discuss and coordinate stuff, sort of the technical work, in ways that aren't just tied to specific issues on specific repos. Because we have certain things that are kind of, cross-cutting across issues or across repositories, where it, might be a useful venue that is sort of more accessible than the Slack channel for folks who might want to contribute or participate for discussing stuff. So I think that would just be a matter of whoever has rights on the organization would just need to sort of flip the switch in the settings. So it's a question of just if we want that.
Yeah, I suspect we do. I think we've got, so I need to actually go back and check on the folks who have rights on the org. There should be a fairly broad set of folks. But when we moved orgs, not everyone accepted the invitation, so I need to go chase people to accept their invitation to the new org. Do other folks have thoughts or opinions?
I would love more asynchronous communication. So I heartily thumbs up.
Yeah, I'm generically an async comms kind of person. I don't have any real experience with GitHub discussions, but I'm always up for new comms tools.
Yeah, I will say, I don't have a lot of experience with it either. Just sort of knowing that it exists, and just the fact that it's integrated with GitHub might make things easier, given that that's the platform that we're using otherwise.
Yeah, I have. I don't get notifications very well from tools like that, so it's a bit difficult for me. I will try to figure out new filters to make them visible as emails, but it effectively becomes email synchronization.
Mm.
Yeah, I do know that one thing that I've got sort of a constant problem with GitHub is that they don't have great tool. They've got this great tool for aggregating all the GitHub related events, which is fantastic. And they have terrible tools for filtering and pruning it. And
at
so
at this point, I have GitHub events or notifications from just too many things to make sense of, you tagged me on one particular patch you need my attention on, I'm probably not going to see it, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the beyond the email notifications, which are a thing, and I agree with your assessment of them for me, the GitHub has an online dashboard of the events that have popped up into your world. Yeah. And I got very excited the first time I played with it because it looked awesome. And then I realized I can't filter or prune reasonably, or even search reasonably through it to look for the things that might matter to me. Because I've got no problem with bringing up a dashboard a couple times a day and seeing what's happened, but it gets swamped with a bunch of events and I can't get out of it.
The funnily to me with that is that GitHub's, so if GitHub sees that you're getting lots of notifications on that, it might pop up here, let me help you manage that, which the solution that it suggests is just unsubscribing from stuff.
No. Well, I mean, and in particular, one of the ones that kills me is one of the projects I work with actually has a fairly sophisticated multi-repo setup that basically can auto-propagate changes. So if I make changes to the API repo, they will automatically propagate down the line, and presuming they continue to pass CI at every step. And so the vast majority of the notifications it gives me are, oh yeah, something just auto-propagated again. It's yeah, I don't care.
Right.
And you give me no way to filter that out. Which should be easy. It's always events that are being driven by an automation user. So I should just be able to filter everything with that user out, but sadly no. So the baseline point is I sort of share your concern about do we want to go ahead and try anyway and see how this works for folks? Cool. All right, then.
Yeah, and the next item I think is also mine. So this is basically, we've talked about for the implementation of Gitoid and of OmniBOR that we would, had this idea of hey, make the Rust implementation the basis for cross-language stuff. That works in many cases. It does not work very well for Go.
No, not at all. No.
Yeah, because
Because
Go doesn't like to talk to other languages, is basically my sense.
it's not so much that, but Go, there are two modes for Go, right? There's I am a Go program. I have been compiled as a Go program. I'm going to go run as a Go program, and they do an enormous number of insanely smart and clever things inside that runtime stack to improve both performance and debugability and metrics and everything else. Or you can use Go in a mode that's known as CGO.
Right.
And the developer experience for CGO is terrible, to the point where there's an entire blog post written by Dave Cheney titled "CGO is not Go." So
okay, and I've seen that before. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you make a Go related thing can you make a Go related thing work with C related things? Absolutely. Do you want to? No, don't do that.
Yeah.
But that said, I see your point about testing.
Yeah, so it's basically, if we're not going to have the same implementation under the hood, then we should have some way of, kind of trying to verify, are these consistent? Like, do we feel confident if you're making a new implementation that it's actually going to do the right things?
Right. And so my first thought is, which particular kinds of tests would we want for that case? Because one is, like the well-formed of the elf embedding is certainly one you would want. Checking basic things. And the nice thing is, even if you get a case where you don't, even if you fall short of being able to apply the test across multiple languages, just having a good test suite to point to, right? Because for the well-formed of the elf embedding, you want to check, do you have the right note name? Do you have the ALEC flag set? Do you have the notes type set? Do you have the, so well-formedness of the elf embedding. What other things come to mind?
I think just having sort of a correct implementation of Gitoid generation, like, hey, if you were given this object, do you produce the correct Gitoid for it? As well as, because I know that it's not, things are sort of in flux, but if you're going to write it out to a file, like a separate file, rather than doing the elf embedding, are you producing that file in the correct format? Both, making sure about the ordering of items, but also about, if you are referring to a thing which has its own manifest, making sure that that's written out correctly with the Gitoid of the artifact. And then I believe right now we have it as it's the blob hash for the artifact, bomb, and then hash for the manifest.
Yep.
And so making sure that that's correct.
Yeah. And the lexical order is a classic one, because that'll screw you up, and it's an easy one to forget.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Any others that come to mind? Certainly a good idea.
I feel like this is a good start.
I'm thinking at least that a nice way to maybe model this, which will drive to what we're going to test, is what kind of structs would you put into a channel in Go to make the requests, and what answers would you get? Because that also leads to a potential evil thing, which is you have a separate process that you message with the structs. In other words, they have to be serializable, and that might also lead to a unified implementation if the Go process can call out to an external process. But what it does is it kind of creates an interface.
Yep.
That interface is the contract which defines the tests. I don't know. As the words come out of my mouth, I realize I'm trying to boil the ocean, so maybe I should shut up.
Yeah, it does lead me to sort of one question, which is, I know that Go is very partial to JSON. I don't know what Rust's feelings are on JSON. I know in other languages it can be a huge pain in the ass. Particularly,
I was going to say Rust is pretty fine with JSON, like using the
Yeah.
Saturday JSON crate.
It's
the
neutral on it.
experience is pretty nice.
Yeah, I mean, I figured Rust had good support for JSON because it's a high enough level language that I would expect that. It's not like C, where it's just, anyway. But the when I say that Go really likes JSON, like literally all the Go build tools have a dash JSON option
Okay.
that will change all the output they produce to JSON, and that's gotten to be a pretty common pattern for Go CLIs where lots and lots and lots of people will have a dash JSON object and they write a Go CLI to output the stuff in JSON, which in my mind is like a little bit more obsessive than just having good support.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I mean, I've certainly seen that kind of like either having like a dash JSON or like a format JSON, kind of flag for Rust programs, and I know I've done it myself for some stuff that I've implemented. I mean, I think should totally be doable. Like if we're wanting to do that for the Rust stuff that we're building. I know that Nell, for example, had a draft Rust CLI thing that was sort of experimenting with using the Gitoid stuff that we were working on. And I mean, like that, I feel like could pretty easily output JSON format stuff.
Right. Yeah, adding it's command line tool and adding dash JSON. There's a lot of precedent for that, for it to output it. So I don't see it being an issue.
Okay.
But I think that lends itself to a really nice language neutral thing, which is what are our JSON messages? And then everything can consume and produce the JSON messages. The implementation is, the detail.
No, interesting thought. Definitely interesting thought.
Perhaps another annex could be about if we wanted to find like a standard JSON encoding of everything. That could make sense. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
So I really just wanted to sort of get everyone's thoughts on this, and then I can move forward with trying to, put something together for a first draft of what this testing might look like.
Cool. Awesome. So, and then on the social media stuff, I know we don't have Chris here today, so I think we'll skip past that. The upcoming conferences and events, I see we've accumulated good stuff on the Usenix conferences that we hadn't had before. The reproducible build conference in Hamburg. Do we have other things that folks would like to add as events here?
RustConf was just announced. I don't know if there's like any sort of connection to make with that.
Yeah, and it's multi-track this year, so I'm on the program committee.
Wow.
So so there's more of a chance for niche talks to get accepted.
Okay, see, and I was excluding it sort of mentally because I was used to it being a single track conference where you sort of want like general audience appeal kind of stuff. Side note, I was surprised that it's not going to be in Portland this year, so that was kind of different.
Yeah, Albuquerque, they wanted a place where we could eat outdoors reliably.
Sure. Cool.
That is so seldom Portland.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's not never Portland. It's just Portland in May is lovely for that. But when is RustConf, by the way?
August usually. Is it August? Again
It's September this year.
Oh, it's September this year. Okay.
Yep. I don't remember the exact dates, but
well, it's good that it's September rather than August, because if it was in spring, you'd have sand in your food, and if it was in July or August, you'd have rain. So September is good.
See, I just like it because previous RustConfs have repeatedly fallen on the weekend of my wife's birthday.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, so glad to not have that happen.
Cool.
Yeah, and most people are not appreciative of like here's a ticket for your birthday. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other conferences that come to mind? I literally can't spell Albuquerque. I'll come back to that later.
Just make sure you take a left at Albuquerque.
Just say like ABQ or something.
There we go. I don't know, the Weird Al Yankovic song always comes to mind for Albuquerque for me.
There's also Breaking Bad.
Just remember, there's a QUE in the center of it. Diffuse.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of roast cooking, not that way. Cool. All right, so then the blog post again. We'll wait for Chris to come back here. Do folks have anything on pucks this week? Okay. There was one thing I did want to kind of bring up, which is OmniBOR for patch. And this came up because I was dealing with some internal folks who were basically saying, look, we've got excellent engineering discipline. We always check into our repo the pristine version of the things we're using, and then we maintain patches that get applied as part of the build process. But that means that we do patch a lot, as you might imagine, for folks who do embedded work in many cases. And so the question really becomes, how do we actually track this stuff? And so the sort of first idea that it came to mind for me was treat the patch file and the original file as inputs from an OmniBOR perspective.
And when you say patch file, you mean like a Git generated patch file as like just what sort of artifact we're talking about, or?
Exactly, generated by Git or diff or one of those things. Yes.
Yeah.
But treat patch as a build tool because it takes those inputs and it outputs the resulting file.
Like the modified versions of the file.
Right. And then the other one that sort of came to mind is we'd had some conversations with folks about how to treat generated files. And particularly how you would do embedding. So think something like, don't take this too seriously. Want to call it that too. Something like that, perhaps. I was taking a little bit of inspiration from SPDX there. We can take a look and see.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
I mean, there's a little bit of room for figuring out the particularities, but the one thing that came to mind here that I didn't have a clever approach to, but maybe someone will have a clever idea, is how do we figure out what constitutes a comment?
Yeah, because that's going to be a language specific.
Yeah, language, file format, and operating system, because line endings.
Yeah.
This gets really messy, and it's one of the challenges that came up, I think, Ed, when you and I were talking to some of the Windows build folks. The amount of inline, in place permutation of source code files that happen in certain languages. And I've certainly worked with plenty of build environments that rely heavily on maintaining downstream patch files. Like anyone who's doing a good build process with an open source upstream is doing that.
Yep.
There is not a clean way other than I'm going to channel one of our other regulars who's not here today. maybe Jeremy is here, and say, if this were not stored in files, but in databases, then it would create a referential structure that didn't rely on actually sticking this in file format specific headings.
I would be kind of curious other people's
Hopefully I did a
thoughts as
decent
well.
job of channeling you there, Jeremy.
Well, actually, I mean, I'm sorry I was late, so I'm missing all the context here, but I did catch just the last couple of minutes. But my immediate reaction is this seems out of scope for OmniBOR because you know, we use source control for managing changes to source files, and so
let me back up and provide the context, because then I think will make it a little bit clearer. You know, which is basically there is, you know, in talking to some of my internal folks, one of the things they do as a matter of engineering discipline is they keep in their Git repos the pristine source code from upstream that they've brought down, and then they keep a collection of patch files that are applied as part of the build process. And there are lots of folks who do this. Most famously, Yocto does this, so that you actually have a clean notion of how you're getting where you're going. And then there had been a whole discussion about treating code generators for DSLs as potentially build tools, because there were people who wanted to be able to trace back from generated code files to the original DSLs. And so the suggestion here was, if you are treating this the patch as a build tool that takes its inputs, the patch file, and whatever original file is being applied to, then you can extend the notion of what OmniBOR does to that. But then the question becomes, what is the proper way to do embedding?
I mean, the thing that occurs to me is just follow the precedent of like the old RCS $ID : tags.
Ooh. Now I feel silly. I've used RCS in anger, and I didn't remember that one.
I mean that, because I mean, otherwise, like putting special comments in a file just because you locally patched it doesn't resonate well with me. I mean, I think that this is sort of coming down to that kind of core question of OmniBOR requiring every file, like every intermediate file, to have some kind of embedding mechanism. You know, as far as, I mean, the reason I bring up RCS because I'm wondering how it dealt with problems like different file encodings. Like if you have a UTF-16 file or a EBCDIC file or something like that, you know, how does that affect this? And like, do we want to have like an embedding that is, I really wouldn't want to have to get anywhere near dealing with like character set encodings or anything like that, or like trying to come up with a way of normalizing this stuff under different encodings.
Yeah, no, and no, I sort of see your point there. EBCDIC is a particularly nasty example. Okay, so that's useful and interesting feedback. Do other folks have thoughts?
I've got a couple. First of all, if we're going to talk EBCDIC, are we also going to talk branch and load register? You know, kind of going back to 360 days. Just a question. But part of the patch file thing, and maybe Ava, I'm not sure whether this is what you said and I didn't parse it correctly. And if I'm repeating what you said, please correct me. But it feels almost like a patch file applied to a source file is very much like what we would do in Git, where we have a different branch, where we have a different branch tag, or tag for revision. Because what we're doing is we're kind of applying a patch. And so, kind of going back to the database/file system discussion, there are certain things that we do in our database. Our database is called Git. And whether that database is materialized on disk or in a database, that's one thing. And then there are certain operations that a compiler performs and that's when we generate the gitoid. But at least in my mind, I'm thinking that part of the overall document is what's the branch of the repository. In other words, what's the git hash of the repository that this all came from? And yeah, okay.
The git branch tag or the git commit hash is
Commit
not
hash.
anywhere in the OmniBOR documents,
Okay.
right?
The
So
other
the
problem
file hash is, and what happens if you implement the support in patch and you leave out embedding the OmniBOR document hash in the resulting file, just leave that out. Then you get your source code file, the original upstream has a hash and an entry in the OmniBOR document storage .bomb folder, for example. After you patch it, you have an entry for that one that refers to the first one. The first one is no longer present on disk, right? It might be present in Git if you're using Git. We can't assume people are using Git.
Okay. Then
there-
thank you for the information and the correction. I no longer have a comment related to this.
I think. Sorry, did I interrupt?
no, go ahead, Jeremy. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing about not including the git hash, the commit hash, is just that the commit hash contains every single change, regardless of whether it's relevant to the particular build. Like if I change the README file, it's going to change the git hash, and it's not going to have any effect probably on the actual artifacts. I do think there's this question of just whether or not you're talking about preparing the files or generating them, like the distinction between generating source files during the build and just preparing the files for the build. Like it seems to me like applying the patches is already implicitly included in the OmniBOR information just by the fact that those file hashes and the fact that you derive those via a patch.
Well, so part of what folks were hoping to do in the discussion and where this originated, I was having sort of an internal discussion with a group of folks, was they wanted to have visibility. So if a CVE came in against the pristine source, they wanted to be able to pick it out of their artifact dependency graphs. And if they had a patch that they were applying that contained the fix, they wanted to be able to have metadata that basically says this patch file contains the fix for this CVE. So that they could, in an automated way, look at the artifact dependency graph and say, okay, we clearly have the potential for having this problem, but we also clearly, if you look up tree and see the patch file, have the fix for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, OmniBOR is a way that you could do that. I just worry that it's a. I mean, I worry that it's trying to overextend it. I mean, the sort of similar thing of like one of the problems that we have in Meta, like we have lots of generated code. Quite a lot of it is generated on the fly by code generators like Thrift or you know, the Google one, I forget what it's called.
gRPC.
Yes, and but we also have quite a lot of generated code that's committed, which is horrible, and but not going to go away, and so
Yeah.
That already has a whole bunch of magic comments in it. So that, like we also have files that are a mixture of handwritten and generated, which is just hideous.
Ooh,
But
that's got to be hard to manage.
Yeah, it is. And so that already has a whole bunch of comments in it, like as metadata annotating things. But from an OmniBOR perspective, those are technically multiple documents in a way. Like the fact that we choose a file boundary as our delimiting thing for hashing artifacts is a little bit arbitrary. But I don't know, that seems like a digression.
Yeah, the file boundary piece. I have had some conversations with folks who wanted to look at sub file things, and it's not inconceivable within the model. It does get to be tricky figuring out the right way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's inherently a coarse model. You know, we're summarizing an entire file down to a fixed size hash. So there are, you know, you could ideally say, you know, there's a distinction between meaningful changes and non-meaningful changes, and you could say that these two files are effectively equivalent, even if they're not byte-wise equivalent. And I think going into that level of complexity, it's reasonable to skip that and just say, no, we're going to talk about byte-wise comparison. And if we're going to do that, then choosing a file boundary is also a bit arbitrary, but fine.
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, the folks I was talking to were looking at doing subfile things, were looking at treating it as metadata on the file itself. But yeah, no, there's interesting thoughts down that road. I agree.
Yeah, I just worry. I mean, the patch is a human, like, you know, we explicitly say that hand-edited, human-edited changes are leaf. So if I make a change to a file and then commit it, then we're not seeing that as in scope for OmniBOR. If I'm writing a patch against a file, that is in effect a handwritten change. So you know, the thing that you're asking, like, you know, the understandable thing you're asking for is we have this separate notion of the original upstream external pristine source plus the local changes. And those local changes may or may not be security fixes. They could just be, you know, how to make it build in our environment or whatever. And if we consider those as in scope for OmniBOR, I think there's just a huge, it seems like a huge sort of overlap with source control.
I mean,
for example, like the way that we handle this is we import the pristine sources and commit them, and then commit the changes, and then have tooling that knows how to cherry pick those changes onto a new version when we need it. So we don't store them as separate patch files. We just store them as regular commits on the basis that that's what source control is for, is tracking changes to source.
Yeah, no, I mean, effectively, those are sort of the two major approaches that I've seen, is the one that you've described versus pardon me, versus the keep a bunch of patches. They both have their pluses and minuses, actually. And you see both out there in the wild.
Yeah. I think this is going to need some time to simmer, because the same question comes up in certain languages, right? I'm gonna reach and challenge me on this one, folks. I think this will come up with Python as well.
How so?
Precompiled .pyc files.
Oh, so
at some point, we haven't gotten there yet, but at some point we've discussed proposing a PEP to add an OmniBOR ID in a standard way to PYC files.
Okay.
Right. It's a little bit different in a sense, because it's not changing the file in place, but it is it's also not exactly a build tool. Like, you can just run the precompiler over things and then take those and move them, or not move them.
I tend to think of the Python actually as a compiled language. because it does go through and compile the PYC bytecode. And so I tended to think about this as actually a traditional compile step.
How about, I think it's JavaScript minifiers.
So JavaScript minifiers are a more interesting example. I tend to see JavaScript minifiers again as a build tool that's essentially compressing the source code. So I do tend to see those much more in the same fashion. But I have a fairly generic model, which is if you're a tool that in a mechanistic way transforms an input, one or more inputs to outputs in a mechanistic repeatable way.
Yeah,
then
patch
I
meets that definition. So does sed.
True.
And I think in one of our car conversations last year, we did touch on the irony of sed.
Much has been said about this. Although,
Awk, are we going to go there?
although fun trivia that I hope no one has to learn the hard way. Sed is traditionally statically linked on Solaris, and so if you ever find yourself in a real pickle, where you cannot use the other editors. No, sorry, no, it's not said that's statically linked. It's VI that's statically linked. I'm misremembering. Never mind. Anyway, yeah, I've been in some unfortunate places where people NFS mounted things they should never have NFS mounted, like user lib, stuff like that. Don't do that. It's a bad plan.
I mean, I think this general question of like every file, like basically to fit within the OmniBOR universe, every file has to have a mechanism to do an embedding. And some file formats are totally inflexible, I think. Like, for example, if you wanted to include MD5 sum output, which would be a bit weird, but like I don't think there's any way that you could squeeze an OmniBOR ID into the output of that.
Sure, like the running of the MD5 sum tool against a file.
Jeremy, I'm going to run with your extrapolation here. To fit within the OmniBOR view of the world, every file needs to be supportable, including in-place modifications of that file, including files whose format is too constrained to support an OmniBOR ID embedding. Git works because it does not require modifying the file. It can support any type of file. Can enough of our assertions about the world hold true if we don't do any embedding and we do everything in a data store adjacent to the files?
If we ignore the like, I mean, there's stuff in the current spec language that explicitly requires an embedding in every file. So if we ignore that,
yeah, what I'm asking is if we elide that from the spec and we go back to principles, do all of our other assertions outcomes hold if we were to remove that from the whole approach?
So the difficulty is like the absolute reduction is the empty file. Like there's any number of build processes that might create an empty file. And so if you come across an empty file, you have no information about what particular way this empty file was generated. And there's obviously a whole bunch of file, like you could imagine, I don't know, license text is not a great example because it's not typically the output of a build process, but you could imagine a build process is just copying around license files. So, you know, a GPL copy of the GPL file would turn up as the endpoint of a whole bunch of different packaging steps, for example. So I think it's particularly difficult. So basically what that would require is the OmniBOR document to also include the output ID, because currently the only coupling between the output of an OmniBOR document and the output itself is the fact that it's embedded. So you would need to add that. And then if you're adding the output to the document, like you basically have two classes of documents, ones which are embedded, which don't include the output, and ones which are external, which do contain the output. And you have to make that distinction because you obviously can't embed the output of the document in the file itself.
Well, and then the other thing that you have to sort of sort through if you embed, and please note this is less of an objection than an observation. If you were to embed the output in the OmniBOR document, right, for that class of OmniBOR document, you still have a search problem, which is if I presented with an artifact, how do I go and find the, how do I go and find the OmniBOR document for that output? And if you're thinking about it purely in a file system point of view, which I know is not your preferred way of thinking about it, but if you think about it purely in a file system point of view, that would require munging through all the available OmniBOR docs looking for the output.
Yeah, I mean, you would, and also, I mean, obviously you could index it or something like that. But I think the key problem there is that there's no reason to expect that you would find only one.
Right. Yeah.
And then
definitely not. And then you've got the problem of how do you know which one to select?
Right. And to a certain extent, maybe it doesn't matter. Like if this pattern of I have this pattern of bits, then this pattern of bits is the same pattern of bits regardless of how it was generated as far as my build step was concerned. So I don't necessarily need to make a decision at build time. It's only later on when you're trying to actually piece together an audit trail that you might care about that.
Well, I mean, there's a little bit of stuff there in terms of reproducibility of builds, because we had the conversation previously about strong versus weak reproducibility. Most of the folks I deal with who are interested in reproducible builds are interested in strong reproducible builds, where I actually really do want to know that the thing I built had exactly the same inputs as last time. And so I can verify it's got exactly the same outputs. And so if I can't tell what the inputs were, then I can't really know what happened, right? You go from having a strong audit trail to a weak audit trail.
Yeah, but imagine if you had a build cache that was content addressed, and so it's keyed by, I'm doing this build step that takes these inputs. And so I cache all of those together and use that as a key for my cache. And then I look it up in the cache and I get an artifact out that matches those criteria, and then I just use it. But it might have been like you then lose the provenance. Like if my inputs were generated one way and that build cache artifact was built from inputs that were generated a different way, but they ended up being bit for bit identical, then I don't even know how that artifact was generated, but it's the right bits. And I definitely know it's the right bits.
Yep, no, I understood.
Yeah. And we lose that aspect of the traceability of an artifact tree. But is that an acceptable compromise to get much broader support?
I mean, I think so. There's a distinct practical usefulness to this, which is if you so for example, if I have a library that has 10 source files, but for whatever reason 5 of those source files are never consumed, and so if I change those source files, then and the output library is unaffected because they're just if def'd out or whatever, then what that means is that if I can see a particular source file as the input to building OpenSSL, and I see that I've got multiple builds of OpenSSL which are identical, even though that source file differs, then what I can say is that source file is not relevant to OpenSSL. So any security vulnerability in that source file is not actually affecting me. And so there is a value to not having such a tight coupling. In the OmniBOR model with the embedding, then those source files contents would definitely become part of that OpenSSL artifact, regardless of whether or not they were used. Whereas if you had external OmniBOR information, they wouldn't necessarily be.
So yes, I agree that that information is very valuable, especially with things like Vex becoming adopted over time, right? Being able to assert that these files weren't, could not have affected the security of this build. Here's how we know that. Here's the evidence for that. Totally agree. But embedding the OmniBOR document hash in the output gives us it changes the reproducibility of it. It's a strong versus weak argument. I think we retain all the properties you were just describing, Jeremy, even if we don't embed. If we have the mapping, and the mapping is stored separately, like in a .bomb folder or somewhere else, I think we still get all of the, we can still generate all the assertions you were just describing by looking at, here's the hash of the output, here's the, the corresponding tree of inputs.
Well, I mean, the difference is that with the embedded IDs, you would always get a different output artifact. Whereas if you have external IDs, then you would end up with a whole bunch of separate graphs leading to that same OpenSSL output artifact. So if all you had was the artifact, and you could hash that, and then you could use that hash to look up the corresponding OmniBOR trees, you would end up with one for every variant of that library that was built with a unused source file. And so I think, I mean, there's the people who want reproducible builds. That's definitely a useful use case. And the people who want to use OmniBOR to, or people who want to track provenance of source files and see whether or not that leads to, they have a vulnerability, that's also a useful use case. And they are not actually the same use case. And they want different constraints. And so either like the reproducible build case is much stricter, and you could use what satisfies reproducible build can also satisfy security provenance, but it's not as good as a system designed for security provenance or vulnerability provenance.
Yeah, but it also depends on whether or not you're dealing with stronger versus weak reproducible builds as well. I mean, one of the things when I talk to my internal reproducible build people that is kind of interesting is they actually like the fact that OmniBOR screws with weak reproducible builds because it lets them detect that they've got a leak. So basically now they can tell that somebody mucked about and decided to pull headers in from someplace they shouldn't or something because the reproducibility gets wonky. And that gets to be kind of obvious at that point.
Interesting.
Because again, they're quite serious about we want to know what, because the other problem you run into with weak reproducible builds is typically they have to do with we're pulling something from the host environment by happenstance, and it happens to work out now. But as the host environments evolve over time, eventually it stops working out. And then eventually you stop being able to reproduce the original host environment the way you wanted to. And then eventually you discover you can't do reproducible builds anymore, which is never pleasant.
Yeah, I mean, we address, I mean, we rely so heavily on caching that the primary thing that we're concerned about from a practical point of view is making sure that we get as high cache hit rates as possible. And so avoiding sort of spurious changes as much as possible. So that getting hermetic builds, we just build things in a container to make sure that there's a very limited amount of host environment that they can reach out to. But yeah, it's difficult. Like, I mean, it's nice to be able to authenticate that you didn't pull in bits of host environment, but
well, and even with the container bits, it's really funny. There's a whole there's sort of two minds in the reproducible build side that I've heard expressed about containers. One is that they're fantastic for reproducible builds, and the other is that they're absolutely terrible for reproducible builds. And the folks from Team Terrible make the point that all too often your containers begin with from Ubuntu 2004, run, apt-get update and apt-get install some line that doesn't have versions on it. And so you
Yeah,
get
I mean,
entirely different results.
the key
But
part
even
of
with discipline, you can fix that problem. But
well, you're right. I mean, our containers also don't allow network connectivity. So
yeah, with discipline, you can fix this problem.
yeah.
But yeah, it is a thing.
But I
So-
think, I mean, the point I was really getting at was like this, like if we have a thrift file, you know, or you know, an IDL or something like that, and you make a comment change and that has no effect on the generated output. And so from our perspective, that generated output being identical suddenly means that we get cache hits in the whole rest of the dependency graph after that and don't have to do any work. And so in effect, no op changes kind of get short-circuited. Whereas if we injected the OmniBOR approach, then those changes would propagate all the way through and we would get effectively spurious builds in which like spurious differences in which the only difference arose from a, you know, comment change.
Yeah. The caching difference is definitely a thing. I think we're running up against the end of time at this point.
I think we are.
All right. So we will see all of you next week then.
Stay safe and healthy, folks.